So I'm sure you read the title, and some of you have read absurd as impossible or stupid, or you should run away from it. But I don't mean any of these things. Of course, I mean to tickle you a little bit with the title of a video like this, but I really do mean absurd, as in absurdly hard, absurdly complex and convoluted. And what I want to do on this topic that's already been covered by so many people is add a product development and engineering perspective from a creation of a high-tech product standpoint, which is really where the people who are invested interest in bringing manufacturing outside of China want to talk about. I'm going to touch on this in a minute. But first, quick recap. How do we get there? Super short. Previous generations have spent decades into shifting manufacturing into Asia for all sorts of reasons. Most of it was to maximize the profit and generate more revenue, taking advantage of the low cost of labor in Asia and other countries. In this context, basically, they shipped out all the know-how, all the infrastructure. They didn't ship out, they got rid of it eventually because there was no purpose for these companies in the West to continue doing these things. And we've lost all of the benefits that come from these jobs. There was also a significant, campaign is probably a little bit over pronounced, but an effort to discredit the manufacturing jobs and making it sound that you're basically, I'm simplifying, you're basically a loser if you're working in manufacturing. But they realized a little bit at the 11th hour that knowing how to make things is a power that gives you the control over your future. And as they're trying to de-risk what I would characterize as supply chain attacks, which are usually about intercepting components of a product for data acquisition, but in this case, it's leveraging the supply chain as a mean of soft war. And forgive my terminology, I'm not a military guy. They want to gain control of these things back, right? Now, it's easier said than done, and that's kind of the point of the topic in here. There's been a lot of people who have done great work to cover the absurdity of making things outside of China. And again, not in the sense that you should not do it, not in the sense that it's impossible, but really about how far we are down this particular rabbit hole and how complicated, difficult, convoluted it has become to make anything outside of China. As a side of a special mention, for those of you who aren't really familiar with how things are getting made in manufacturing work as a whole, or maybe you have a headline level understanding, which there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of channels, I'm going to leave some links, that are covering these things. They're showing you how things are being made, a little bit of the reality of how to make things. And most of the time it's low-tech products, but I think it's very important to understand what goes into the things that you use and you buy every day. But then on the specific aspect of manufacturing process outside of the US, I'm going to give two notable mention. A great article from a guy named Molson Hart, who, after reading it myself, I thought, what else is there to add to it? Because he really covered comprehensively the topic from the perspective of trying to build a product. In this case, it was a low-tech product, but it was still very interesting. And more recently, Smarter Every Day made a video when covering building a low-tech product, but in a right level of depth and some of the nuances that goes into what I want to touch about. This is the manufacturing techniques and how much it matters when it comes to be building a high-tech product. So why is it absurd? If I wanted to simplify this in one thing that is comprehensible for everybody, I would just say it's DFM. DFM stands for Design for Manufacturing. Now, in the West, it's a practice that is often considered as an afterthought. And what it basically means is that when you design a product, absolutely anything, right? So, this mouse, anything else, you have to be taking into the design considerations that are solely for the manufacturability of the product. And what that means is being able to make it in the first place, but then also making it in an efficient way so that you can lower the time it takes to make it, so you can actually use different kind of techniques, etc. What I mean by when it's seen as an afterthought is I have spoken and advised a lot of people who would take DFM coming after they've done the industrial design, after they've done a few prototypes, and that's kind of the part that is a bit catastrophic. I attribute this disconnect to the disconnect that there is from the manufacturing techniques. As a very quick note, something I've observed from some engineers and product people in the West is that they tend to have an attitude where they basically have what I would call a boy in China, where they design their product and they toss their design over the fence over there, and they just let them figure out how to actually make it. What I've seen happening behind the scene is that these people who know manufacturing will take your design and redesign it so it's actually manufacturable, because precisely they have this proximity to the manufacturing techniques. So, but this disconnect from the manufacturing techniques that is illustrated on the DFM process, it's a two-way street. When you design, you have to take into consideration manufacturing, and the manufacturing is going to be educating your design. So if you do not have access to all the manufacturing techniques that exist today and are being constantly developed, you as an engineer, as a product person, have a limited amount of options when it comes to designing the product you want to create. And that is fundamentally the problem. If you do not control the manufacturing, you do not control the end quality of the product. On this aspect, there is a level of trust and faith in 3D printing. And again, I'm a user of it, right? I use it. I have 3D printed stuff everywhere. I'm going to touch about this in 2 seconds. But there's a level of faith in 3D printing that is, for me, borderline delusional into the West. And there's great progress on it. There's absolutely amazing things. I'm not attacking the technology whatsoever, but it will not be the silver bullet that can just suddenly bring the manufacturing into the West at cost with a magic wand of automation and a little bit of design. And because you need all these different techniques for different kinds of criteria, for strength and applications of the properties of materials and speed of execution, which all drives the cost, etc., etc. So that is really fundamentally the real problem, and why it's so absurd to build everything in China, is because all these manufacturing techniques that are essential in the design of the process, basically they only exist in China. Outside of China, it's somewhat of a desolate world. It's a desolate world, but it's also a problem to be able to bring it to the level of China. There's a chicken and egg problem. Because you gotta be able to feed this flywheel. So let's say I want to start creating screws, custom screws. Now the reason why I like this story is because in 2013, I believe, Apple was bringing back a Mac Pro factory into Texas. And they started to talk about precisely the need for them to modify screws. And I realized then, and particularly with my experience at DJI, that a lot of people think that the way we design high-tech product is in a cascading chain of event, right? They think that we design, then we do prototypes, and we settle on it, and then we manufacturing, and then we just pump these one after another. But the manufacturing element is a living body. It changes over time as we discover new things. The product design changes over time as you have to accommodate to different things. So you need to have a dynamic manufacturing capability. And in the case of the story is, maybe I need a new custom screw because the guy who used to make the screws no longer makes them, because I realized that this one was rubbing too much, because I realized it's not strong enough, and you always need this flexibility. And if I'm the guy who wants to be creating the screws, I could buy the machines and start spinning screws, but I need to create this flywheel where I'm going to be able to sell these screws to enough people who are going to be around my vicinity or around my reachable vicinity. So think about this, more like the logistics that we have these days give you a longer reach. And so that actually can start creating and making screws in the US, in Europe, in the West, outside China. And that's what is very, very hard, is because you do not have this traction. Everybody's got to have to be a little bit completely crazy and kicking off and beginning this effort on their own. And despite all the way you hear, I'm going to talk about this, the infrastructure to support you in this venture is anemic and definitely undersized. So what you end up is basically, I'm the screw guy, I launched my stuff, I haven't gone around covering the expense of my machines. All I can offer you is expensive and slow, right? And so that's where you have fundamentally a problem. So you are a product engineer, right? You got to be figuring out how to do stuff. And imagine for a second that you don't have any constraint about which country you're going to build things. You get to go to China and have it fast and cheap, or you get to go outside China and have expensive and slow. Makes no sense. It's absurd. But that's fundamentally the reality that everybody's going, and very few people want to talk about it for the simple reason that as soon as we talk about China, as soon as we talk about these kinds of topics, everybody gets riled up, everybody wants you to pick a side and everything like this. And what I want to cover is that when you want to create the best product, there's no sides to pick but the customers. You're here to build what the customer wants. And that's exactly why it justifies building things outside of China. Because some customers, and more so these days, are asking for things to be made outside of China for the reason I mentioned in the beginning. And that is all there is to it. You don't need any more reasons to build things outside of China. It's still absurd. It's still going to be a mega pain in the ass, but it's all you really need is to have this customer asking you for this. Now, there is a couple of things I want to be touching. A lot of the content on the manufacturing, and even my example of the screws, was a low-tech element. And you're going to think, but high-tech is different, etc. Well, not really. It's just that the more high-tech the product is, when you start building things like robots or drones, the more of these little layers you have. So what I liked about the video from Smarter Every Day is that he goes around and he starts about the squishy bit. And he changes at some point the material for it for something else, right? So in this particular squishy bit is just enough of a complexity element that it creates conversation. Now imagine that you have 1,000 squishy bits. Now you start talking about the complexity of a high-tech product, right? Because then you need to actually have the components. Where is the silicon created? Where is the casing created? Where is the actual packaging created? All these things come in and compound. And we're right now coming in at the 11th hour after having created a worldwide hyper-efficient machine to provide all these things for us. We're saying like, hey, we're just going to flip it around and see how it goes. Again, not impossible. Definitely something that is interesting and worth doing. And again, if the customer wants it, this is all where the story goes. But it is absurd. It's absurd what we're asking ourselves to do. So this complexity that high-tech product brings is particularly important because if it is already difficult, if it is already absurd to do low-tech product, it's even more absurd to do high-tech product because they involve even more compounding manufacturing steps. Now, where it is less absurd is because the justification for these is a bit higher and therefore motivating an industry, a group, a society, a combination of different actors to make it happen is more possible on high-tech product, is more possible on sensitive topics than it is on just the average thing, right? This is like, we're not going to be bringing, I don't even know, but paper clips, right? It's not going to be actually changing any needles whatsoever. No one is going to be dying on the hill of making paper clips in the West. And I'm sorry if there's people who are making paper clips in the West. I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm trying to use an example that is highly contrasted so that the point comes across. So let's talk about, all right, so it's really absurd, it's really hard, and it's all because of the lack of options that engineers have. And in the end, it's already hard enough to create a good product. So why would I make my life even harder by having less limitation, right? So I think you get the point. But so that what should we do about it? Well, figuring out if you need to, right? So, and this is it's a strategic, it's a customer profiling understanding, it's a product characterization effort to figure out if your product or part of the product or all of the product has to be made wherever you are outside of China. As a very cartoonish thing, you can tell the whole story about what happened with Apple and the tariffs that the Trump administration have applied. And then so they moved their manufacturing in India, and then they got slapped on the finger where they were told that, well, we didn't ask you to bring it to India, we want you to bring it back to the US. And that's kind of like where it is. Now, of course, it's easier said than done. It's a monstrous machine to be bringing all this stuff in, but that's kind of the point. You got to be characterizing exactly what's asked for. Now, if you work in defense, for instance, the conversation gets simplified quite quickly. The stakes are so high. The customer is not going to be taking any chances. They have the risk profile in what they do and who they are, that it could be targeted. You're going to be bringing this wherever it matters. But there's also some nuances. Even in the outside of China world, there's like layers and nuances of trust, etc. So defense becomes complicated. So first, figure out if you really need to. Because if you absolutely don't need to, don't make it an ideology thing. This is becoming pure product advice, but as a pure product advice, don't make your decision based on some belief that you have or a mission that you're on, etc. I mean, you're going to do it. So that's why I'm making this advice as a bit as a counterpower. I'm just saying that don't do it too much because it's a very, very popular hill to die on. Then the second thing I would say is understand what I call the push-pull forces. So push-pull forces is is a concept that applies to more than just this context. And it's basically a way of representing what forces are in what you're trying to do. So in this case would be manufacturing things outside of China, are going to be pulling you towards your goal and pushing you towards your goal, right? So pull would be the demand and push would be the active support that exists. Now, if I take an example, right? So these days drones is a hot topic in terms of manufacturing. There is a real beginning of a pull force that is starting to be created for things to not be made in China. And it represents itself in clarification of what not made in China looks like, although there's still a lot of clarity that needs to be done. But you have things like the NDA laws in the US who are clarifying kind of like a little bit the rules of engagement. Again, tons of interpretation in there, tons of work to be continuously done, but it is a pull force. You have contracts who are happening, who are now actively buying products who are meeting these criteria have just been established. And as a bleeding things, it's not just defense. You also start seeing that public money is now being tied to buy products who aren't coming from China. So you see these kinds of things bleeding out in sectors like education funds, where you have to be providing products who aren't coming from different kinds of countries, which, for the sake of this video, I'm simplifying as outside China, because it's kind of like the big topic. And then you're going to have any of the things that is like really basically buying your specialty. If I were to make this as another image, I would say it's kind of like when you were like when they were kicking off organic food, right? And then if no one is buying it, then no one is going to make it. No matter how much you think is great for the planet, no matter how much anyone is tweeting about it, if no one is buying it, if there's no pull force, no one is going to do it. No one is going to back it. And speaking of backing, that goes back to the push forces. Now, push forces are a lot weaker these days on the context of drone manufacturing, because the governments in the West are wildly counting on private sector to be able to fund things. Now, if there's a super strong pull force, the push force on private sector will come, right? No investor is going to pass on the opportunity of investing 10, 20 million if there is 300 million as a reward at the end of it. The reality is, until then, for the specific context of drone, which I'm using it as an example now, is that these pull forces have been very weak. They start to be a little bit stronger now. And so therefore, the push forces were very different. And some companies, some investors, have gone into the push side without having the pull coming in. And it cost them a lot. And it cost them a lot. It cost the industry as a whole a lot of reputation in terms of viability of an investment. But it cost them a lot. But as a push force, it can be a special economical zone, right? Where the government invests a lot of money to start supporting something, an idea that had been floating around for people who wanted to do this. I said, you do a PPP loan for all the people who are trying to bring this capability in, so that they don't have to carry the burden and the risk of the capital investment in all these machines. To my knowledge, there is nothing like this in the US, but I could be wrong. There are some programs like this in Europe, in the EU. And that for me is very important because it helps people de-risk their investment. That's a push force. But basically, you as the person who's going to try to build something, who has now figured out that you want to be doing this or you have to be making this outside of China, characterize your push and pull forces, and now you got a bit of an idea where the things are. And the last, let's say, is figure out if you have it in you, because it's really, really hard. It's really miserable to be building things because you're working at a disadvantage in terms of what's available to you in terms of options, and you have to be building the things. You have, at very least, have to be building the relationship and the partnership with people. You have to put up with the vendors who are learning these things again, right? Who are like bringing back some of these manufacturing capabilities, some of these quality control capabilities, and that's going to slow you down, and that's going to have an impact on your delay. That's going to have an impact on your commitment. That's going to have an impact on things. It is really, really hard. So you better have it in you. I would say if you're in it for making a quick buck, that's not a great idea of a business plan. I'm not here to give you like financial advice or whatever, but this is going to be it's a hard journey to be on. So as a conclusion, because this is getting long already, I want to reemphasize a couple of things. I personally don't think there's anything wrong making stuff in China. I don't think there's anything wrong making things outside of China. I don't think there's anything wrong of on purpose avoiding to manufacture things in China. I don't really care where you make things as long as it is matching what your product wants to be and what your customer wants. Of course, dishonesty is a real problem. Pretending that something is a thing and not being it is a problem. But beyond these things, it's really for the sake of an engineering, product development effort or entrepreneurial effort. My point is just build what your customer wants, understand what you're getting yourself into, and then just get on with it. Just get on with it, but don't get caught up into the delusion that is ambient. Don't get caught up into the promises that 3D printing is going to save the world. I'm going to show this thing. This is the wheel of a robot that I'm making. I'm 3D printing it because that's what I have at home. This is going to be a toy, right? No one cares. That's unsellable as it is. That's unsellable. That's structurally not strong enough, even though it's almost solid, right? 3D printing is great, but that's not going to save everything else. I can buy you some time. It has a lot of forgiveness to it, but it's not going to be enough as you go down. And I would say as a last measure, and it's a bit of a, it's not me being critical, it's more me being, frustrated and I would say sad. So don't buy too much about what some government are going to be telling you, that they really want this to happen, etc. Because like I said, if I'm going around from the extent of this narrative of bringing manufacturing outside of China, it's more than 10 years old now. But for the majority of that period, the pull forces has been very, very weak, and the push forces has been pretty much non-existent. And so when you're getting down into this rabbit hole in there, it's a turkey shoot if you go down this path and you don't really have all of these things lined up correctly for you to be successful.